My name doesn't matter as much as the story does, but for the sake of this telling, you can call me Adrian. I'm 34 years old now, and I'm sitting in a small apartment in a quiet part of the city, the kind of place where the afternoon light comes in slow and honest, and I've been thinking for a long time about how to talk about the years that made me who I am. I want to tell this story the way I would tell it to a close friend across a kitchen table, not the way people usually tell these stories online, with big reveals and dramatic music and a promise that something shocking is about to happen. There is nothing shocking here. There is only a life, my life, and the slow, sometimes painful, sometimes beautiful process of learning who I actually was underneath all the noise I inherited from the world. I was born in a small town in the middle of nowhere in particular, the kind of town where everyone knows your father's name before they know yours, and where the church parking lot on Sunday morning is fuller than the grocery store on Saturday afternoon. My father worked at a plant that made industrial fasteners, small metal pieces that held bigger things together, and I always thought there was something poetic about that, because he was also the kind of man who held our family together with quiet, unspoken pressure. My mother taught 4th grade at the elementary school 2 blocks from our house, and she was the softer of the two, though softness in our household was rationed carefully, like sugar during a war. I had one older brother, Daniel, who was 3 years older than me and who seemed to have been born already knowing all the rules of being a boy. He played football. He broke his arm falling out of a tree when he was 9. He learned to shoot a rifle before he learned long division, and he was in every visible way the son my father had ordered from the catalog of expected sons. I was the second draft, and from very early on I understood, without anyone ever needing to say it directly, that I was not going to be as easy a fit. The first memory I have that connects to any of this, and I've turned it over in my mind so many times that I'm not entirely sure anymore which parts are memory and which parts are interpretation, is from when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old. My mother was folding laundry on the bed in her room, and I was sitting on the floor beside her, and she was singing something under her breath, some old song from her own childhood, and I remember watching her hands move across the fabric and thinking, I want to be like her. Not in a way I could have articulated then, and honestly not in a way that had any shape at all beyond a feeling. I just wanted to be near that softness. I wanted to belong to it. And then she asked me to hand her one of my father's undershirts, and the spell broke, and I remember the small confusion of realizing that I lived on the other side of some invisible line, and that the line had already been drawn before I was old enough to know it existed. Childhood in a place like that follows a script. You play with the boys, you get dirty, you wrestle, you learn not to cry when you scrape your knee, and if you do cry, you learn very quickly not to do it again. I was not a natural fit for the script, but I was a fast learner, and I became very good at performing the role that had been written for me. I want to be careful here not to sound like I'm blaming anyone, because I don't think my parents were bad people. I think they were doing what they knew how to do, in a place that had never given them permission to imagine anything else. My father wasn't cruel. He was distant, sometimes frustrated, and he had a way of looking at me that made me feel like he was trying to solve a problem he didn't quite have the tools for. My mother loved me. I know she did, but her love was filtered through the same expectations that shaped everything else in that town, and she couldn't see past them any more than I could when I was small. The first time I remember consciously wanting to wear something that wasn't meant for me, I was about 8 years old. My cousin Rachel was staying with us for the weekend while her parents were out of town, and she had left one of her cardigans draped over the back of a chair in the guest room. It was pale yellow with small pearl buttons, and I remember standing in the doorway of that room for what felt like a very long time just looking at it. I didn't touch it. I didn't try it on. I just looked at it and I felt this quiet, aching curiosity that I didn't have a name for, and then I felt something else that I did have a name for, which was shame. Shame arrived very early in my life, and it arrived without needing to be taught, which tells you something about how deeply the messages of that time and place had already sunk into me. I closed the door and walked away, and I didn't think about that cardigan for years, or at least I told myself I didn't. Adolescence was harder. I'm not going to pretend it was some unique kind of hard, because every teenager suffers, and every teenager thinks their suffering is the first suffering the world has ever seen. But there was a particular texture to mine that I only understood much later. I was 13 when I started to notice that the other boys in my class were changing in ways I wasn't quite following. They were becoming louder, more angular, more certain of themselves in some fundamental way, and I felt myself moving in a different direction that I couldn't have described if you'd held a gun to my head. I wasn't attracted to boys, or at least not in the way I understood attraction then. That's important to say because a lot of people assume that a story like mine has to be about who you love, and mine wasn't. Mine was about who I was. Those are different questions, and confusing them makes it harder for everyone to understand what's actually happening inside a person. I had a best friend in middle school named Marcus, and Marcus was one of those kids who seemed to move through the world without ever questioning anything. He had a girlfriend by the time we were in 7th grade. He could talk to adults like he was already one of them, and he had this easy confidence that I studied the way other kids studied for tests. I wanted to understand how he did it. I wanted to reverse engineer his comfort in his own skin, because I was starting to realize that I didn't have any of my own. When I was around Marcus, I could pretend. When I was alone, I couldn't, and the gap between those two versions of me was getting wider every year. The first time I actually put on a piece of women's clothing, I was 15. It was a Saturday afternoon. My parents had driven Daniel to a football tournament 2 towns over, and I had the house to myself for the first time in what felt like forever. I want to describe this moment carefully because I think a lot of stories like mine get this part wrong. They make it sound thrilling or transgressive or somehow charged with excitement. It wasn't. It was one of the most quietly terrifying moments of my life, and also one of the most honest. I went into my mother's closet, and I stood there for a long time, just breathing. And then I took down a simple blue blouse, one she wore to church sometimes, and I put it on over my t-shirt, and I looked at myself in the mirror on the back of her closet door. And I didn't feel euphoric. I didn't feel like I had found some hidden self. What I felt was a strange, quiet recognition, like when you meet someone you've never seen before, but who somehow feels familiar. I felt like I was looking at a person, and that person happened to be me, and that had never quite happened before. And then I heard a car door slam outside, and my heart nearly stopped, and I took the blouse off so fast I almost tore a button, and I put it back exactly where I had found it, and I ran to my room and pretended to be doing homework, and I didn't breathe properly again until I heard the car drive away. It had been the neighbor. My family didn't come home for another 3 hours. But something had shifted in me that afternoon, and I couldn't put it back the way it had been. I want to talk about the years between that first afternoon and my early 20s, because I think this is the part of stories like mine that gets skipped over the most, and I think it's the most important part. Because for about 8 years, I did nothing with what I had discovered about myself except try to push it away. I threw myself into being who I was supposed to be. I played sports I didn't care about. I dated girls I liked as friends, but didn't understand romantically the way I was supposed to. I went to church every Sunday and I prayed, honestly and desperately, to be different than I was. I made deals with God the way children make deals with God, offering up all sorts of promises and sacrifices in exchange for one small change in the fabric of who I was. I would be a better son. I would be a better student. I would be kinder to Daniel, who I had grown to resent for no reason that was really his fault. I would do anything, I told God, if he would just take this thing out of me, whatever this thing was, because I didn't have a word for it then, and I wouldn't have a word for it for years. The word came slowly, and it came from a lot of different sources. It came from the internet. Once we finally got the internet in our house when I was 17, and I would stay up late looking at pages that I would close in a panic every time I heard a footstep in the hallway. It came from books I found in the university library once I moved away for college, books that used language I had never encountered but that felt, somehow, like language that had been waiting for me. It came from other people, eventually, though that took the longest because I was so afraid of being seen that I couldn't stand to be in the presence of anyone who might see me. I studied engineering in college, which was a practical choice, a choice that made my father nod approvingly when I told him. I was good at it, in the way that people who are trying very hard to be someone else are often good at whatever they set their minds to. I made friends, I passed my classes, I called home every Sunday evening at 7, and underneath all of it, I was drowning quietly in a way that nobody could see. I want to talk about the promise, because the promise is the reason I'm telling this story the way I'm telling it, and it's the thing that changed everything, though not in the way I expected. When I was 24, I met a woman named Elena. Elena was 2 years older than me. She worked as a graphic designer at a small firm downtown, and she had a laugh that made you want to say funny things just to hear it again. We met at a coffee shop, in the kind of accidental way that only happens when you're not looking for anything, and we started dating within a month. She was the first person I had ever been with who I felt like I could actually be myself around, which is a strange thing to say when you consider that I hadn't even told her the biggest thing about myself. But there was something in her that made me feel safe in a way I hadn't felt safe since I was very small, and I fell in love with her, honestly and completely, and I didn't know what to do with that love, because I knew I was carrying a secret that I hadn't figured out how to share. I dated Elena for 2 years before I told her. I want to be honest about that because I think a lot of people in stories like mine either come out immediately in a burst of brave truth or they hide their whole lives, and neither of those is quite what I did. I sat with it. I turned it over. I tried to imagine every possible version of the conversation, and none of them ended in a way I could stand. And in the meantime, I loved her and she loved me, and we started to talk about a future, and I knew that I couldn't build a future on top of a foundation that had a room in it I had never let her see. So one night, in the small apartment we had just moved into together, I told her. I don't remember exactly what I said, because the words came out in a way that felt like they were being spoken by someone else, but I remember her face, and I remember the long silence afterward, and I remember thinking that whatever happened next was going to be one of the most important moments of my entire life. She didn't leave. That's the first thing I want to say, because I know how many stories like mine end with the person leaving, and I understand why they do, and I don't judge anyone who has made that choice. But Elena didn't leave. She asked me questions, careful and gentle questions, for a long time that night, and she cried some, and I cried some, and at some point in the very early morning she said something that I have thought about every single day since. She said, "I don't fully understand this yet, and I don't know what it means for us, but I promise you that whoever you are underneath everything, I want to know that person. I want to meet them. If you're brave enough to show me, I'm brave enough to look." That was the promise. Not that she would stay forever, not that everything would be easy, not that she would love whoever I turned out to be. The promise was that she would look, that she would not turn her face away. And I realized somewhere in the days after that night that I had been waiting my entire life for someone to promise me that. And I realized also, and this was harder, that I had never made that promise to myself. I had spent almost 30 years turning my face away from who I was, refusing to look, and I could not ask Elena to do for me what I had never done for me. The next few years were the hardest and the most important years of my life. I started very slowly to explore Elena, and I would go out sometimes, at first only in the apartment, and eventually to places where I could try being someone other than the version of me I had performed my whole life. I don't want to make this sound simple because it wasn't. There were nights when I looked in the mirror and hated what I saw because I had internalized so many other people's judgments that they had become my own voice, and I couldn't tell them apart from myself anymore. There were fights, real ones, between me and Elena because she was trying to love someone who was in the middle of becoming, and that's a very difficult person to love. There were times I wanted to go back, to close the door and never open it again because the pain of exploring who I was felt greater than the pain of pretending. And there were also moments, small and rare at first, and then more frequent, when I felt something I had never really felt before, which was the feeling of being at home in my own skin. I started seeing a therapist during this time, and I want to say something about that because I think a lot of people in stories like mine get to this part and skip over it, and I don't want to. The therapist's name was Diane, and she was a small woman in her early 60s who had been doing this work for a long time, and she was the first person outside of Elena who I ever fully told the truth to. Therapy was not magic. It was not one revelation after another. It was slow, patient work, the kind of work that feels boring while you're doing it and only reveals its worth years later. Diane taught me a lot of things, but the most important thing she taught me was that identity is not a destination, it's a conversation. It's a conversation you have with yourself, and with the people who love you, and with the world, and it doesn't end. There is no moment when you finally figure out who you are, and get to stop asking. There is only the ongoing practice of listening and being honest, and adjusting when you need to. That has stayed with me. I want to talk about my family now, because I've been avoiding it, and I've been avoiding it because it's the part of the story that still hurts, in the quiet, low-grade way that old wounds hurt even after they've healed. I told my mother first. I flew home for a weekend when I was 28, and I sat with her at the kitchen table after my father had gone to bed, and I told her as much of the truth as I thought she could hold. She listened. She was quiet for a very long time. And then she reached across the table and took my hand, which is something she had not done in years, and she said, "I don't know what to do with this. I need time. But you're my child. You've always been my child. And I want you to know that." I want to be honest and say that my mother's journey with this has been imperfect. She has not been a perfect ally. She has said things over the years that hurt me, sometimes because she didn't understand and sometimes because she was scared. But she has kept trying, and I have come to believe that trying over a long enough span of time is a form of love. My father was harder. He didn't speak to me for almost a year after my mother eventually told him because I could not bring myself to have that conversation directly. When he did start speaking to me again, it was cautious and clipped, and the topic of who I was not something we discussed. We talked about the weather and about his job and about the small facts of daily life, and I understood that this was what he could offer me, and I decided, after a lot of pain and a lot of thought, to accept it. Not everyone gets a father who says the things they need to hear. Some of us get fathers who show up in the ways they know how, and that has to be enough. Or you have to find a way to make it enough, because holding on to what they cannot give you is a kind of slow poison. Daniel, my brother, surprised me. He called me one afternoon, about 6 months after our mother had told our father, and he said he had been thinking. He said he was sorry he hadn't been a better brother when we were kids. He said he had known somehow that I was struggling and he hadn't known how to help, and he had been thinking about it a lot lately, and he wanted me to know that whoever I was, he was on my side. I cried on that phone call. I cried in a way that I had not cried since I was a child, and I realized that I had been carrying a resentment toward my brother for most of my life that he had never earned, that had been the product of my own pain being projected onto him, and I let it go on that phone call, or at least I started to let it go. That process is not over either. Most of the important processes in a life are not ever really over. Elena and I are still together. I want to say that clearly because I know that a story like this creates a lot of expectations, and one of the expectations is that either the relationship ends in heartbreak or it survives as some kind of triumphant fairy tale, and neither of those is quite true. We are together. It has been 10 years since the night I told her, and we have built a life together that neither of us could have imagined then. It has not been easy. There have been years when we barely made it. There have been moments when we sat across from each other, and one of us said, "I don't know if I can keep doing this," and the other one had to decide whether to fight for it or let it go. We chose, both of us, to keep fighting. And what we have now is not the relationship we had when we started, because the people we were when we started don't quite exist anymore. But it is ours, and it is honest, and it is one of the great gifts of my life. I want to say something about crossdressing, since that word is in the title of this story, and I know it's what brought some people here, and I want to talk about it directly and honestly because I think it's a word that carries a lot of weight that it doesn't necessarily deserve. For a long time, I thought of what I was doing as crossdressing because that was the language I had. I was a person who had been assigned male at birth, and I was putting on clothes that were coded as female, and there was a word for that, and the word was crossdressing. But over the years, I have come to understand that the language you use for yourself matters, and it matters not because of what other people think, but because of what it lets you see about yourself. I don't really think of myself as a crossdresser anymore. I think of myself as a woman, and I have for several years now, and the process of coming to that understanding was not sudden, and it was not dramatic. It was slow. It was one small realization after another over the course of years. It was Diane, in one of our sessions, asking me a question I had never been asked before, which was, what would it feel like to just be, without any label at all, and let the label find you? And it did, eventually. The label found me, and it was not the one I had expected. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you my story, so that you'll see yourself in it and reach the same conclusions I did. I'm telling you my story because for a long time I didn't hear stories like it, or the stories I heard were sensationalized in ways that made me feel like a spectacle instead of a person. If you're watching or reading this and you're in the middle of your own exploration, I don't want to hand you a map, because I don't have one. What I have is a lantern, and I can hold it up and show you a little piece of the road I walked, and maybe that will help you see your own road a little more clearly, and maybe it won't, and either way is fine. I want to talk about some of the practical things I've learned, because I think the philosophical parts of stories like mine get all the attention, and the practical parts get ignored, and the practical parts are actually where a lot of the real work happens. I have learned, for example, that self-acceptance is not a feeling. It's a practice. It's something you do every day in small ways, whether or not you feel like doing it. On the mornings when I look in the mirror and I don't like what I see, I still have to feed myself breakfast, and I still have to go to work, and I still have to be a person in the world. And the practice of self-acceptance is not about waiting until I feel good about myself to do those things. It's about doing them anyway, and treating myself with basic decency while I do them, and trusting that the feeling will come and go and come and go, and that my worth as a person doesn't depend on which side of that wave I happen to be on today. I have learned that community matters, and that it doesn't have to be a big community. For years I thought I needed to find some large group of people who were exactly like me, and I chased that idea for a while, and I found it wasn't what I actually needed. What I actually needed was a small handful of people who saw me clearly and loved me anyway. Elena is one of them. Diane, my therapist in her professional way, is another. Daniel, my brother, has become one, slowly. I have two close friends, both people I met in my 30s who know me as I am now and who have never known any other version of me, and there is a specific kind of peace in that, in being known only as you actually are, without a longer history of pretending muddying the water. I have learned that ethics matter in this journey, even when it doesn't feel like they do. I made mistakes along the way, and I want to name them because I don't want to pretend that a story of self-discovery is somehow above the ordinary ethical demands of being a human being. I was not always honest with Elena in the early years about how much I was struggling. I let her carry weight that wasn't fair for her to carry alone. I was, at times, so consumed by my own process that I forgot that other people had processes too, and that they deserved my attention and my care even when I was in pain. I've had to apologize for some of that, and I've had to forgive myself for other parts of it, and both of those things are ongoing. I have learned that mental health is not separate from any of this. For years, I thought my depression and my anxiety were separate from my identity struggles, and I tried to treat them as separate problems, and it didn't work. When I finally started to accept that they were all part of the same conversation, that the pressure of hiding who I was had been producing a specific kind of internal weather in me for decades, I was able to start treating myself with more coherence. I take medication now for anxiety, and I've taken it for several years, and I want to say that clearly because there's a lot of shame in our culture around psychiatric medication, and I refuse to participate in that shame. My medication is not a failure. It is a tool, one of many, and it has helped me live a life that I actually want to live. I have learned that responsibility is not the opposite of self-acceptance. In fact, I think they're the same thing, seen from different angles. Being responsible for myself means being honest about who I am and taking care of the people who love me and paying my bills and going to my job and being a good neighbor and voting and doing all the ordinary things that make up a life. It means not using my identity as an excuse to hurt other people and not letting other people use their opinions about my identity as an excuse to hurt me. It means holding myself to a standard that has nothing to do with the outside world's approval and everything to do with my own sense of who I want to be. I want to say something to anyone who is watching this or reading this because they are worried about someone they love. Maybe you have a child or a sibling or a partner or a friend, and they have told you something recently that you don't know what to do with. I want to say to you from the other side of that conversation that the most important thing you can do is not solve it. Don't try to solve it. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to talk them out of it, and don't try to rush them into it either. Just be present. Just keep showing up. Just say, I don't fully understand, but I love you, and I want to know you, and I'm not going anywhere. That is the most powerful thing you can possibly do. Elena said something very close to that to me on the night I told her, and it changed the shape of my life, and it did not require her to have any particular knowledge or wisdom or expertise. It only required her to be honest and to stay. I want to say something to anyone who is on the other side of that conversation, who is thinking about telling someone something they've never told anyone. I want to say that you get to decide the timing. You get to decide who and when. You do not owe your truth to anyone who has not earned it. Safety matters, and I don't just mean physical safety, though sometimes I do mean that too. I mean the safety of your own inner life. You are allowed to protect that, even from people who love you. And when you do decide to tell someone, whoever it is, you get to tell them in your own way, in your own words, at your own pace. There is no right script. There is only your voice, saying what is true, to someone who has been chosen carefully to receive it. I've thought a lot about what the story is really about, and I've decided that it's not really a story about identity, or about clothing, or about the labels I have or haven't chosen to use. It's a story about honesty. It's a story about the long, hard work of telling the truth about yourself, first to yourself, and then to the people who matter, and then, eventually, to the world. It's a story about how that work is not glamorous, and it is not linear, and it does not have a clean ending, and it is worth doing anyway because the alternative is a life of quiet pretending, and I know from experience what that costs. It costs your health. It costs your relationships. It costs your ability to be present with the people you love. It costs, in the end, your relationship with yourself, and that is the most expensive thing you can ever lose. I still live in the same city where Elena and I moved when we were young. Our apartment is different now, a little bigger, with a small balcony where we grow tomatoes in the summer that never quite turn out the way we hope. My parents visit sometimes, though not as often as I would like. My father and I have reached a kind of peace, wordless and imperfect, and I have accepted that this is what he can give me, and I have found other places to receive the things he cannot. My mother and I talk on the phone every Sunday still, and our conversations have changed over the years, and there are things we can talk about now that we could not talk about 10 years ago, and I take that as evidence that people can change, even late in life, even when the changing is hard. Daniel has 2 kids, a boy and a girl, and they know me only as their aunt, and there is a specific joy in that, in being loved by small people who have never had to unlearn anything to love me. They call me by my name, my real name, the one I chose for myself, and hearing it in their voices is one of the most healing things I have ever experienced. I don't know what the point of a life is, and I'm not going to pretend I have any special wisdom about that just because I've done a lot of thinking about my own. But I have come to believe over these 34 years that the point of a life might have something to do with becoming who you actually are and then being useful to other people in whatever way that particular self can be useful. That's what I try to do now. I do my work, which I still find meaningful, though I've changed careers once since I was young. I take care of the people I love. I try to be honest, especially when honesty is inconvenient. I try to remember that everyone I meet is in the middle of their own story, and their story is just as complicated and painful and beautiful as mine, and they deserve the same patience and grace that I have learned, slowly, to give myself. If there is a lesson in all of this, and I hesitate to package it that way because life doesn't really come with lessons, only with experiences that we then have to make sense of, but if there is a lesson, it might be this. The person you are pretending not to be does not go away because you refuse to acknowledge them. They wait. They wait in the closet, in the mirror, in the small hours of the morning when you can't sleep, and they wait patiently because they are not going anywhere, because they are you. And the longer you make them wait, the more it costs you, and the more it costs the people who love you, because you cannot love anyone else fully while you are refusing to love yourself. Elena taught me that without ever saying it, just by being willing to look. Diane taught me that in her patient, professional way. My brother taught me that when he called me that afternoon and let me hear something in his voice I had never heard before. My mother is teaching me that still, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that mothers teach things sometimes. And I want to end by saying that I know this story is not universal. I know that not everyone who explores their identity ends up at the same place I did. I know that some people try on a new understanding of themselves and find that it doesn't fit, and they go back to what they knew before, and that is also a valid outcome, and it should be respected. I know that some people know from the time they are very small who they are, and they don't need years of confusion to figure it out. I know that some people never get the chance to figure it out at all because the world around them will not let them, and I carry those people in my heart even though I don't know them because their pain is not so different from what mine could have been if I had been born in a different place, or a different time, or to a different family. Identity is not one shape. It is 1,000 shapes, and every person gets to work out their own, and the best thing any of us can do for each other is to make more room, wherever we can, for that work to happen safely and honestly. I don't know what your story is. I don't know why you're here, reading or listening to mine. Maybe you're in the middle of your own version of what I went through, and you're looking for company. Maybe you love someone who is, and you're trying to understand them better. Maybe you're just curious, and you clicked on this because the title caught your eye, and you've stayed longer than you expected to. Whatever it is, I'm glad you're here. I hope some part of what I've said has been useful to you. I hope if you take anything away from it, that it's the small, quiet truth that you are allowed to become who you are, and that becoming is not a betrayal of who you were, it is a fulfillment of who you always could have been, if the world had made a little more room for you sooner. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.